5 ancient legends, the oldest nightmares on Earth. Before written language captured our fears, before cities rose from wilderness, before humanity learned to record its nightmares for posterity, there existed legends so terrifying that they survived millennia through nothing more than whispered warnings passed from parent to child. These are not modern ghost stories or contemporary urban myths, but primordial terrors that emerged from the deepest shadows of human consciousness when our species was young and the boundary between the natural and supernatural world was paper thin. These ancient horrors have survived the rise and fall of empires, the birth of world religions, and the advance of scientific enlightenment because they speak to fears so fundamental that they transcend culture, geography, and time itself. They are the monsters that taught our ancestors what it meant to be afraid, and their influence can be traced through every horror story that has ever been told. What makes these legends truly terrifying is not just their age, but their persistence. In an era when we can explain most phenomena through science and reason, these ancient fears continue to resurface in modern encounters, suggesting that some horrors are so deeply embedded in human experience that they refuse to be dismissed as mere superstition. If you really like our channel, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more daily horror stories. Thanks. Number 1. Apep, the serpent that devours reality. In the shadow-haunted temples of ancient Egypt, over 5,000 years ago, priests recorded warnings about Apep, the cosmic serpent whose very existence threatened the fundamental structure of reality itself. Known also as Apophis, this primordial entity represented the ultimate horror. Not merely death or suffering, but the complete annihilation of existence, light, and order. Egyptian cosmology described Apep as dwelling in the underworld, a massive serpent stretching across the entire width of the afterlife, waiting to devour the sun, god Ra, during his nightly journey through the realm of the dead. Ancient texts describe Apep as impossibly vast, measuring miles in length with scales that reflected no light, and eyes that burned with the fire of absolute nothingness. The serpent's breath could extinguish stars, its movement could crack the foundations of heaven, and its voice could drive both gods and mortals to madness. But Apep's true horror lay in its purpose, the systematic destruction of everything that had ever existed or could ever exist. Each night, as Ra's solar bark traveled through the underworld, Apep would attack with fury that shook the cosmic order. The serpent would coil around the sun itself, attempting to swallow the source of all light and life. If Apep succeeded, darkness would consume not just Earth, but every star, every planet, every dimension of reality. Time itself would cease, consciousness would be extinguished, and the universe would collapse into primordial chaos. The nightly battle required active human participation to ensure the sun's survival. Egyptian priests performed elaborate rituals to strengthen Ra and weaken Apep, understanding that failure could result in permanent destruction of existence. They would burn wax effigies of the serpent while reciting binding spells, stabbing them with consecrated knives while chanting the names of Apep's enemies. What made Apep particularly terrifying was its intelligence and malevolence. This was not mindless destruction, but a conscious entity that understood exactly what it was destroying and took pleasure in the suffering its actions caused. Ancient texts describe Apep speaking during its attacks, taunting Ra with descriptions of eternal darkness and promising that all life would suffer before being extinguished. The serpent possessed the ability to corrupt other beings, turning gods and spirits into servants of chaos who would assist in reality's destruction. These corrupted entities would spread throughout the cosmos, sabotaging the natural order and creating weaknesses that Apep could exploit during its nightly assaults. Modern archaeological discoveries reveal that fear of Apep permeated every aspect of ancient Egyptian society. Common people wore protective amulets, spoke defensive spells before sleeping, and organized community rituals to assist Ra. The intensity of these measures suggests Egyptians believed Apep's victory was not just possible, but increasingly likely as the world aged. Perhaps most disturbing is the suggestion in some texts that Apep grows stronger over time, learning from each failed attempt and developing new strategies for cosmic destruction. These writings imply that the serpent's eventual victory is inevitable, that the nightly battles merely delay rather than prevent the end of all existence, The most horrifying aspect of the Apep legend isn't just the cosmic scale of destruction it represents, but the implication that our entire universe exists in constant siege by forces that seek not just to harm or rule, but to completely erase everything that has ever existed. If reality itself is locked in eternal struggle against entities whose sole purpose is annihilation of existence, then every moment of life is nothing more than a temporary victory in a war we are ultimately destined to lose. How many other cosmic predators lurk in the spaces between stars, waiting for their opportunity to devour not just our world, but the very concept of worlds existing at all? Number 2. Lilith, the first demon. Long before biblical accounts, ancient Mesopotamian tablets spoke of Lilith, a primordial entity whose rebellion against divine order established the template for every demon and night terror that would follow. Dating back nearly 6,000 years to earliest Sumerian civilizations, Lilith represents humanity's oldest recorded encounter with supernatural evil that specifically targets human relationships and domestic safety. According to ancient versions of her legend, Lilith was created as Adam's first wife, formed from the same clay and given equal status. However, she refused to submit to Adam's authority, demanding equality in all aspects of their relationship. When Adam insisted on dominance, Lilith spoke the secret name of God, a forbidden act that gave her supernatural power, and flew away from Eden to dwell in wilderness beyond divine protection. Her transformation from woman to demon occurred gradually, as Lilith discovered her rebellion had horrific consequences. Divine punishment compelled her to seduce and destroy human relationships, particularly targeting newlyweds and pregnant women. Her physical form changed, developing wings like a bird of prey, talons for hands, and eyes that glowed with inner fire that could entrance victims. Ancient Assyrian and Babylonian texts describe Lilith as a night demon who could pass through walls, become invisible, and enter human dreams to plant seeds of sexual corruption and domestic discord. She would appear to sleeping men as the most beautiful woman imaginable, seducing them in dreams so vivid they would wake exhausted and obsessed, unable to find satisfaction with mortal women. Lilith's influence extended beyond individual seduction to systematic corruption of society's fundamental institutions. She could disguise herself as trusted friends or even spouses, whispering poisonous suggestions that would turn family members against each other and destroy bloodlines through internal conflict. Her power grew stronger during moments of transition, weddings, births, intimate connections between people. Perhaps most terrifying was Lilith's ability to corrupt the concept of love itself. Those under her influence would find themselves unable to experience genuine emotional connection, instead developing obsessions with supernatural entities that could never be reached or satisfied. This spiritual contamination would spread through families, creating bloodlines cursed with inability to form healthy relationships. Medieval texts expanded Lilith's legend, describing her as mother of demons who bred with fallen angels to create entire species of supernatural predators. These offspring inherited her abilities to corrupt human sexuality and destroy domestic happiness, establishing networks of demonic influence operating across generations. Archaeological evidence from across the ancient world shows protection against Lilith was a universal concern transcending cultural boundaries. Amulets bearing her name have been found from Mesopotamia to Egypt to ancient Europe, suggesting encounters with this entity were widespread enough to create international awareness of her threat. The legend established the archetypal pattern, followed by every succubus and seductive demon in subsequent folklore. Her combination of supernatural beauty, sexual power, and malevolent intent became the template for entities that could corrupt human desires and transform natural intimacy into spiritual destruction. The most chilling implication of the Lilith legend is that the very foundations of human relationships, love, trust, and sexual connection, may be actively targeted by supernatural forces that view our capacity for intimacy as weakness to be exploited. If demons specifically study human emotional vulnerabilities to develop more effective corruption methods, then every expression of love becomes a potential doorway for evil influence, and every moment of trust becomes an opportunity for spiritual predators to establish footholds in human consciousness, How many relationships throughout history have been destroyed by supernatural influences masquerading as natural problems? And what happens when entities with thousands of years of experience decide that subtle influence is no longer sufficient? Number 3. The Rakshasa, devours of human souls. In sacred Hindu texts dating back over 3,500 years, scholars recorded encounters with entities so fundamentally opposed to human existence that they represented evil in its purest form. The Rakshasa were described not merely as demons, but as anti-humans, beings created specifically to serve as the opposite of everything that makes us human, existing solely to corrupt, torment, and ultimately devour human souls. Ancient Sanskrit texts describe Rakshasa as shapeshifters, whose true forms were so hideous that seeing them could drive mortals insane immediately. Their bodies were grotesque inversions of human anatomy, hands attached backward with palms facing outward, feet twisted to point wrong directions, and faces that could shift between human beauty and monstrous horror. Their eyes glowed with inner fire that revealed burning hatred for all human life. But physical appearance was merely the beginning of their horror. These entities possessed intellectual capabilities far exceeding human intelligence, combined with thousands of years of experience studying human psychology and weakness. They use this knowledge not for advancement, but solely to cause maximum suffering before consuming souls. The Ramayana describes Rakshasa as masters of illusion, who could create entire false realities designed to trap human consciousness. They would construct elaborate deceptions lasting years, building fake relationships, careers, and life experiences that felt completely real. Only when the human soul became completely dependent on these illusions would the Rakshasa reveal the truth. Everything the victim cherished was a lie designed to maximize despair before spiritual consumption. These demons excelled at infiltrating human society by assuming identities of trusted individuals. A Rakshasa could perfectly mimic appearance, voice, memories, and personality traits, killing the original and taking their place in family structures. They would live as spouses, parents, and friends for decades, slowly corrupting everyone around them while feeding on spiritual energy of unsuspecting humans. The most terrifying aspect was their patience. Ancient texts describe cases where entities maintained human disguises for entire lifetimes, raising children who never suspected their parent was a demon, building careers and reputations, and establishing networks affecting hundreds of people. The psychological damage inflicted on families discovering a beloved relative had been a Rakshasa-created spiritual wounds persisting across generations. Hindu scriptures detail supernatural abilities including shape-shifting, illusion creation, emotional manipulation, false memory implantation, and altering perception of time and space. They could make victims experience entire lifetimes of false experiences and moments, or trap them in psychological loops where traumatic events repeated endlessly until sanity shattered. Soul consumption by Rakshasa was described as ultimate spiritual violation. Unlike simple death allowing consciousness to continue through reincarnation, being devoured meant complete annihilation of the soul's existence. The victim's spiritual essence would become part of the demon, their memories absorbed to make future deceptions more convincing, while consciousness faced eternal torment within the demon's spiritual prison. Ancient protection required constant vigilance and community cooperation. Families developed secret signs known only to true relatives, performed daily rituals to verify spiritual authenticity, and maintained elaborate surveillance systems to detect demonic infiltration. The paranoia required for protection made trust almost impossible, as any person could potentially be a demon wearing a familiar face. Perhaps most disturbing was the suggestion in some texts that Rakshasa were created specifically as cosmic tests of human spiritual development. According to these accounts, entities were designed to challenge humanity's capacity for wisdom and growth by presenting obstacles that could only be overcome through highest levels of spiritual evolution. The most chilling implication is that our most trusted relationships and familiar social structures may be compromised by entities whose sole purpose is destruction of human spiritual evolution. If demons with thousands of years of experience can perfectly mimic human behavior, while maintaining elaborate deceptions for decades, then any person in our lives could potentially be a supernatural predator, studying our weaknesses and preparing to consume our souls. How many positions of trust throughout history have been occupied by Rakshasa, using infiltration abilities to corrupt society from within? And what happens when these ancient demons decide the time for subtle deception has passed? Number 4. Wendigo, the hunger that consumes humanity. In the frozen wilderness of North America, indigenous peoples preserved warnings about the Wendigo for thousands of years. A creature so fundamentally opposed to human nature that its existence represents the ultimate violation of everything that makes us civilized. Long before European contact brought written language, tribal shamans passed down detailed accounts of humans transformed into supernatural cannibals whose hunger could never be satisfied and whose presence could corrupt entire communities. The Wendigo legend originated among Algonquian peoples of the Great Lakes region, but variations appear in oral traditions across North America, suggesting encounters occurred throughout the continent for millennia. According to ancient accounts, Wendigo was not born as monster, but created when humans violated the most sacred taboo, consuming human flesh during starvation. Transformation from human to Wendigo was described as spiritual corruption so complete it altered behavior, physical form, and supernatural capability. Those who resorted to cannibalism would initially experience relief from starvation, but consuming human flesh would trigger changes making return to normal life impossible. Their hearts would be replaced by ice, skin would become gray and corpse-like, and appetites would expand beyond any possibility of satisfaction. Ancient tribal accounts describe Wendigo growing larger with each human consumed, eventually reaching gigantic proportions visible from vast distances. Limbs would stretch to unnatural lengths, fingers would elongate into claws capable of tearing through trees, and mouths would expand to accommodate increasingly massive prey. Eyes would glow with inner fire, revealing constant hunger, and voices would become sounds that could drive listeners mad. But true horror lay not in physical transformation, but psychological impact on human communities. The creature retained enough intelligence to hunt strategically, often targeting strongest members to maximize survivor despair. It understood human social structures and would exploit family relationships, appearing as lost relatives to lure victims from protective groups. Wendigo presence created spiritual contamination affecting everyone within its territory. Humans exposed to the creature's influence would experience unnatural hunger, aggressive impulses, and desires to consume human flesh even when other food was available. This psychological corruption could spread through communities like plague, turning family members against each other and destroying social bonds necessary for survival. Tribal shamans developed elaborate rituals to prevent Wendigo transformation and protect communities. These ceremonies required entire tribal participation and could last weeks, involving fasting, purification rites, and spiritual exercises to strengthen human identity against corrupting influence of supernatural hunger. The intensity suggests encounters were common enough to require permanent community vigilance. Most terrifying was the suggestion that transformation was irreversible. Once a human consumed human flesh and began changing, no ritual could restore their humanity. They would be driven by endless hunger growing stronger with each feeding, eventually becoming so consumed by need that they lost all connection to former human identity. Wendigo possessed supernatural abilities, making them nearly impossible to hunt using conventional methods. They could move through deep snow without tracks, appear and disappear like shadows, and travel vast distances in impossibly short periods. Their intelligence remained human level even after transformation, allowing them to use tools, set traps, and develop hunting strategies incorporating knowledge of human psychology. Perhaps most disturbing was Wendigo's ability to create others by forcing humans to consume human flesh. The creature would keep victims alive for extended periods, gradually breaking down psychological resistance until they willingly participated in cannibalism. This reproduction method ensured populations could grow rapidly during times of social stress when communities were most vulnerable. The most horrifying implication is that civilization may be far more fragile than we realize, and the difference between human and monster may be nothing more than a single desperate decision during extreme hunger. If consuming human flesh can trigger supernatural transformation, destroying individual humanity and threatening entire communities with spiritual corruption. Then every survival situation becomes a test of whether we can maintain human identity under circumstances making violation of deepest taboos seem necessary for survival. How many isolated communities throughout history have faced Wendigo outbreaks that destroyed them from within? And what happens when climate change creates the exact conditions that have historically triggered such transformations? Number 5. Draugr, the undead who remember. In mist-shrouded fjords of ancient Scandinavia, Norse storytellers preserved accounts of Draugr, walking dead who refused to accept boundaries between life and death. Returning from graves with supernatural strength, malevolent intelligence, and eternal hunger for revenge against the living. These were not mindless zombies, but conscious, cunning undead who retained memories, personality, and human intelligence while gaining supernatural abilities that made them far more dangerous in death than in life. Earliest Draugr legends appear in Norse sagas dating back over 1,500 years, but consistency across Scandinavian cultures suggests encounters had occurred for millennia before written records. Unlike other undead creatures, Draugr were created not by curses or infection, but by sheer force of will of individuals who refused to accept death when they had unfinished business among the living. Ancient texts describe Draugr retaining perfect memories of human lives, including detailed knowledge of family relationships, personal grudges, property ownership, and social obligations. This retained consciousness made them uniquely dangerous, as they could use knowledge of human psychology and community structures to plan elaborate campaigns of revenge against those who had wronged them or their descendants. Physical transformation enhanced their bodies beyond normal limitations, while corrupting appearance into something inspiring immediate terror. Draugr grew larger and heavier than in life, developing supernatural strength to crush bones and tear through solid wood. Their skin turned blue-black and became unnaturally cold, while eyes glowed with inner fire, revealing their undead nature. Most terrifying was their intelligence and capacity for long-term planning. Unlike other undead driven by simple hunger, Draugr could develop complex strategies for achieving goals. They would spend years observing targets, learning routines and weaknesses, before executing revenge plans designed to maximize psychological torment rather than simply causing death. Draugr possessed supernatural abilities, making them nearly impossible to defeat conventionally. They could change size at will, becoming small enough to squeeze through keyholes or growing to giant proportions. They could become incorporeal, passing through walls, or assume stone-like weight and density when wanting to crush victims. They demonstrated ability to control localized weather, summoning fog, creating supernatural cold, and generating storms. Perhaps most disturbing was their ability to drive living humans insane through psychological warfare, exploiting intimate knowledge of victims' fears, guilt, and emotional vulnerabilities. They would appear in dreams, delivering messages containing information only deceased relatives could know. These supernatural communications would gradually erode sanity, creating conditions where victims welcomed death as relief from psychological torment. Ancient accounts describe Draugr creating other undead through various supernatural corruption methods. They could bite victims and transmit their condition like disease, or corrupt recently deceased individuals by preventing souls from departing for the afterlife. This reproductive ability meant infestations could grow exponentially if not contained quickly. Norse communities developed elaborate burial rituals specifically to prevent Draugr creation and protect the living from undead revenge. These procedures included binding corpses with iron chains, driving iron nails through feet to prevent walking, and placing heavy stones on chests. The complexity suggests encounters were common enough to require systematic community response protocols. Most sophisticated Draugr were described as capable of infiltrating human society by disguising their undead nature and assuming positions of authority or trust. They would use these positions to corrupt entire communities from within, gradually turning the living against each other while feeding on spiritual energy generated by fear, hatred, and despair. The most chilling aspect is the suggestion that death itself may not be sufficient to end human consciousness, and that individuals with strong enough emotional attachments to the living world can force their way back through sheer determination and hatred. If the boundary between life and death is permeable enough to allow conscious minds to return with enhanced supernatural abilities and infinite time to plan revenge, then every death becomes a potential threat to future generations. How many burial sites contain individuals who possess the emotional intensity necessary to become Draugr? And what happens when social disruption begins disturbing ancient graves, potentially awakening undead entities who have spent centuries planning revenge against descendants of people who wronged them before civilized society even existed? Thank you for listening. If you really like the story, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more daily horror stories. Thanks.